Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 32. The topic is Evolution, a Historical Perspective. Discussing agenda for the topic is Introduction, the Darwinian Revolution, Scala Naturae, and Classification of Species. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about the timeline of various pre-Darwinian evolutionary concepts. Introduction. A hungry bird in the Peruvian rainforest would have to look very closely to spot a dead leaf moth, Oxytenis modestia. On the right side of your screen, you can see leaves decaying on the forest floor, and if you look at them closely, this particular body, what it seems like a drying leaf, is in fact a living individual. It is a living organism belonging to the phylum Arthropoda, class Lepidoptera. Why this organism has adopted such a phenotype, such a leaf-like phenotype? What is the advantage of such an adaptation? The advantage is to provide protection against birds, against its predators. Birds are predators on these moths, so therefore the nature has provided them protection by molding their shape into leaf-like forms, so that they are disappeared in their surroundings. This is just one example of the class Lepidoptera. It is a large class of organisms comprising of 120,000 species, and the predominant forms are moths and butterflies. And all of these 120,000 species, they share some common features. They have 3 pairs of legs, 2 pairs of wings, and they are covered with small scales. But there are also certain differences because they are divided into species, so there must be some differences between them, and they are grouped together into the same class, so there must be some similarities, and these are the similarities on the basis of which they are grouped together in the same class. How did here come to be so many different moths and butterflies? What is the reason for such a rich diversity in this group? Why are so much diverse forms existing in this group and elsewhere in the animal kingdom or plant kingdom? And what causes their similarities and differences? Why the organisms, some organisms tends to be similar to each other, whereas others show differences with each other? So what are the bases for these similarities and differences between organisms? The moth and its many close relatives illustrate 3 key observations about life. What are these 3 key observations? The first one is the striking ways in which the organisms are suited for life in their environments. If you look around, you will have lot of examples of organisms living in such an environments where you will start thinking that this organism was created for that particular environment, just like that example where this organism is so much suited to that environment, where we can assume that this organism was created for that particular environment. The many shared characteristics, unity of life, just like here Lepidoptera has 120,000 species, and each and every member of that species share these characteristics. The rich diversity of life, there are similarities between organisms. At the same time there are differences between organisms. So what is the basis for those similarities and differences between the organisms, and why the organisms are so perfectly suited to the environments where they are found? More than a century and a half ago, Charles Darwin was inspired to develop a scientific explanation for these three broad observations. Charles Darwin was a very famous evolutionary biologist. He was born in 1809, and he carried out his investigation about the prehistoric life and the life which was in existence, and he thrived to build a relationship between the organisms and how they came into existence, and what is the basis for the similarities between the organisms, the differences between the organisms, why the organisms are so much adapted to the environment where they live. On the right side of your screen you can see his famous manuscript where he incorporated all his findings, and it was published in 1859. So now we define evolution. He was a famous evolutionary biologist. When we talk about evolution, the very first name that comes to our mind is Charles Darwin, but you will be a bit surprised to know that in that particular book, Darwin mentioned the word evolution only in the last paragraph of that book, in the very last paragraph. In fact, he used the word descent with modification. He didn't use the word evolution. He described the change which occurs in the organisms with the passage of time through this particular notion, descent with modification. It means that Earth's many species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from the present day species. Means the descendants tends to be different from their ancestors. The ancestors used to live in the ancient in the prehistoric era, and they are different from the ones that exist nowadays, and the species which exist, which are living nowadays, are evolved from the one that lived in the past. And a more generalized definition which can apply nowadays because of the broadening of our understanding about genes and DNA, is that evolution can be defined as change in the genetic composition of a population from generation to generation. Genetic composition is the frequency of a particular allele or a particular genotype in a population. We will describe the word gene pool, which is the aggregate of all copies of every type of allele at all loci in every individual in a population. So when the change occurs in gene pool, we say that evolution has occurred. We can also view evolution in two related but different ways, as a pattern and as a process. What is pattern? Pattern is a particular way in which something is done, and process is a continuous action or operation or series of changes taking place in a definite manner. So there are three patterns of evolution. Convergent evolution, where the dissimilar species gradually become more similar. Divergent evolution, where when closely related species gradually become very different. And the third type is parallel evolution, when change occurs in two species, then these two species are related with each other, so the change that occurs in them is at a constant level. So the pattern of evolutionary change is revealed by data from many scientific disciplines, including biology, geology, physics, and chemistry. These are the different sources of knowledge which gives us idea whether the process of the pattern of evolution is convergent, divergent, parallel evolution, or coevolution. The process of evolution consists of the mechanism that causes the observed pattern of change. Here, what Darwin reported as natural selection was the process responsible for evolution. Indeed, the power of evolution as a unifying theory is its ability to explain and connect a vast array of observations about the living world. So the theory of evolution is one of the biggest contributions in biology, and it explains the similarities which exists amongst the organisms and the differences which exists amongst the individuals. The Darwinian revolution challenged traditional views of a young Earth inhabited by unchanging species. At the time when Darwin started his studies, there were people who were of the opinion that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and some of the people who were more confined, more inclined to biblical teachings, were of the opinion that the creation is perfect, the species are perfect, and they are fixed, and they are unchanging. So the mindset of the people was not ready to accept anything, any idea about change, about evolution, and to stand up and to say something about a change which is contrary to the teachings of the religion and to the knowledge prevailing at that time, was something which was a great changing force. What impelled Darwin to challenge the prevailing views about Earth and its life? So from where Darwin picked up different ideas which enabled him to brought a revolution to incorporate or to come up with something of his own. From where he picked up his ideas, research is like building a second story on the top of the first one. So what were the different clues which enabled Darwin to say something from his own side? It was the work of various researchers, which includes Charles Lyell, Charles Hutton, Alfred Wallace, Thomas Malthus, Cuvier. These were the various researchers whose findings enabled Darwin to present his theory of natural selection. And some of the findings were also reported through his 5-year journey in HMS Beagle, where he spent time on the Galapagos Island and observed the fossils of animals and birds on the Galapagos Island and the South American mainland, and observed the differences and the similarities between them. Now we will come to Darwinian evolution in our coming lectures. Here we confine our attention to this particular portion, Scala Naturae and classification of species. Long before Darwin was born, several Greek philosophers suggested that life might have changed gradually over time. Darwin was born in 1809, and before the birth of Darwin, several philosophers, Greek philosophers, were of the opinion that life is name of change, and change has occurred in life, or the passage of time means the living forms have changed gradually over time. But one of the famous philosophers who influenced early Western science, Aristotle, viewed species as fixed. So it means that Aristotle did not believe in evolution. He was an opponent of evolution. Through his observations of nature, Aristotle recognized certain affinities among organisms. He studied living organisms and he identified certain similarities, similarities or certain common features between the living organisms. He concluded that life forms could be arranged on a ladder or scale of increasing complexity, later called the Scala Naturae, scale of nature, just like you have a 10 or 15 stairs and you have different organisms and you arrange these organisms in each stair on the basis of their complexity. The most simple organisms are placed on the first stair, on the second stair which organisms which are a bit more complex, on the third stair the organisms are placed which are still more complex, and with that order you move towards more and more complexity with each climbing stair. So it was Aristotle who arranged living organisms in such a way, such a scale, and it was called Scala Naturae or scale of nature. Each form of life, perfect and permanent, had its allocated rung on his ladder. Just like here, just for example, you put bacteria here, then you put protozoans here, then porephrines, coelantrates, then you put here fishes, amphibians, birds, reptiles, birds, mammals. So in this way he arranged the species. These ideas were generally consistent with the Old Testament account of creation, which holds that species were individually designed by God and they were perfect. Old Testaments, I think they are referring to one of the Bibles and the teachings of that holy book, which reckons that the creations of the God are perfect and therefore are unchanging. In the 1700s, many scientists interpreted the often remarkable match of organisms to their environment as evidence that the Creator has designed each species for a particular purpose. In 1700s, the scientists studied organisms in different environments, and just like the example we studied in the first slide, where the moth was perfectly suitable to the environment where it was found, many examples were reported where the organisms were perfectly suitable to the environment where they were found, and therefore they concluded that the Creator had designed each species for a particular purpose. One such scientist was Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish physician and botanist who sought to classify life's diversity, in his words, for the greater glory of God by placing ourselves and our sources at the service of others, and especially those most in need of help. He was one of the most influential researchers of his time, and he was the first person who used a generalized system to classify living organisms into groups and subgroups, and he is also known as the father of taxonomy. He is also known for introducing the binomial nomenclature, or the two name system for each organism, and he is also the author of a famous book which is called as Systema Naturae, which was published in 1758, 101 years before the manuscript of Darwin was published. And why he was doing so? Because in his own words, for the greater glory of God means to appreciate the creations and the glory of the Almighty, means the purpose of life is not just to achieve things but to help others and to do things which signify the glory of Almighty. In 1750s, Linnaeus developed the two-part or binomial format for naming species that is still used today. In contrast to the linear hierarchy of the Scala Naturae, Linnaeus adopted a nested classification system, grouping similar species into increasingly general categories. For example, similar species are grouped in the same genus, similar genera are grouped in the same family, and so on. Linnaeus did not ascribe the resemblance among species to evolutionary kinship, but rather to the pattern of their creation. So, at the time of Carolus Linnaeus' work, he himself was not aware of the evolutionary process, so he classified organisms only on the basis of their physical outlook, on the basis of their physical resemblance or differences. So it was a classification based upon the phenotype of the organism. And this classification was more detailed, more generalized, and this was his classification. So evolution predicts that living things will be related to one another in what scientists refer to as nested hierarchies, like nested boxes. Groups of related organisms share suits of similar characteristics, and the number of shared traits increases with relatedness. So the snakes and lizards are close to each other because they share a recent common ancestor. The birds and crocodiles are closer to each other because they share a common ancestor, and those two branches also have a distant common ancestor, and the whales and camels have common ancestor. So this classification was based upon the physical similarities or differences, and there was no evolution taken into consideration. And nowadays we know that if the two species have any kind of evolutionary relationship, then only then they will have similarities in their phenotype or physical outlook. So you can relate these similarities to the common descent or to the common ancestor. That's the end of the lecture. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.